Welcome to today's webinar, Strategies to Optimize Costs Using AWS. Our presenter today is Amilcar Alfaro, Marketing Manager for AWS. Today with us, we also have James Macedonio, Rotem Yusuf, and Niraj Javeri, who are Business Development Managers for the Cloud Economics Group. They will serve as our webinar moderators, and they will be engaging with you and answering your questions throughout the presentation while Amilcar presents. Amilcar, welcome. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending the webinar. As was discussed a minute ago, today we're going to be talking about the strategies to optimize costs using AWS. I am a marketing manager in the Enterprise and Cloud Economics team, and we will be giving you some ideas, thoughts, and strategies around how you can get the most out of your AWS investments. So without further ado, let's get started. So what to expect in this session? So the first thing we're going to be talking about today is we will be introducing our approach for building the business case for moving to the cloud and sharing some tips around how to be the most innovative and how our customers that are the most innovative can help you drive successful architecture and adoption of cloud economics and getting the best out of your investments. So essentially, we're going to talk about how to realize the most out of the economics of the AWS cloud. So to start with, we're going to have to frame the conversation around some topics that you might be familiar with. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is TCO. For many of you, the term TCO might be a long-standing term, something that you're intimately familiar with, and it's no surprise because it's something that has been talked about for a very, very long time. TCO has a very, very powerful purpose, and we define it as the comparative total cost of ownership between running infrastructure, whether it's on premises or on a co-location environment, and comparing it against what it would be to have an equivalent set of infrastructure in AWS. TCO is used to compare the cost of running this infrastructure in its entirety between two different systems for any one specific workload. And what that allows you to do is to have a very specific comparable framework between the infrastructure that you would be running, your own servers, your own switches, your own licensing, your own labor, and comparing it against how it would cost to run exactly or a very similar set of infrastructure on the cloud. And TCO is very critical in budgeting and building the business case for moving to AWS. We could preface that a TCO analysis is fundamental to really do the due diligence when you're thinking about moving to the cloud. So how do we do it? The first thing we have to think about when we look at AWS is to articulate very clearly that running on-premises infrastructure is not the same as running your workload in AWS. And there are some very fundamental differences that articulate why this is not the same. So the first thing we do when we look at TCO is break apart all the different components that are built and designed to support your workload. So we talk about the acquisition costs and the operational costs that make the aggregate of everything you're needing to run your infrastructure. So we break it down into four categories. The first is server costs, where we look at not only the hardware and the physical boxes, but we also look at the racks, we look at the chassis, we look at the PDUs, switches. In addition, we look at all the software, so the operating system, virtualization licenses, maintenance packages that you might be needing to run them. And on top of that, you get this pretty significant overhead around facilities, which includes space, power, and cooling. These costs are typically overlooked when people are thinking about costing out and doing a full due diligence in TCO and comparing against the cloud. The second category is storage, which in a way has some of the very similar components that we had with servers. When you talk about storage disks, building your storage area networks, fiber cable switches, administrative costs, and some of the same very components in the overhead are included there as well. The third component is networking, where you have to build your LAN, you have switches, load balancers, bandwidth costs, administrative costs, and the same set of overhead that you had before. And lastly, you also have the IT labor costs that could span a variety of different elements. You have not only the traditional IT administration costs for your core infrastructure, but you might have a number of different automation and operations roles and services that are available within your organization that cost you money. So when you think about evaluating the comparison between AWS and what you're doing on premises or on colocation, it's really critical to do a very thorough and detailed analysis of what you're spending today versus what you would be spending in the cloud. And as this slide illustrates, the diagram really doesn't include everything. It doesn't include a database software. It doesn't include the ecosystem, middleware, and a variety of different things, ranging from taxes to financing. So having a clear understanding of all these different components is really important when you think about TCO. As you move on forward, one of the things that we recommend is that you give some of our tools a try. And the first thing that we would want to recommend is that you all go out and look at our TCO Calculator that allows you to do some pretty rigorous comparisons between on-premises infrastructure and AWS. This calculator now includes 6 or 7 services, including compute and several variants of storage, and gives you a really good comparison between what you're going to be doing when you do your migration to the cloud versus what you have when you run on-premise, and it gives you a really nice detailed report. This tool is available online. We also have a backup and archive calculator, and we're coming up with a set more over the course of the year. So we strongly recommend that you use these tools when you're starting to do your analysis. So once you've done this first preliminary analysis and you've really come up with your first recommendation around TCO, you're probably feeling pretty good about yourself. There's certainly a lot of different benefits on the economic side that make the AWS argument very compelling. There's definitely a good number of reasons why you should feel that this is going to be a solid pitch as you get into your finance discussions. However, when you get your first meeting with the CFO after you've been running AWS for a little while, the conversation might go a little differently. And this is where the reality of running the cloud, running your workloads in the cloud and running them appropriately can have a little bit of a different nuance from the financial perspective. So what we're going to talk about today in a little bit more detail is cost optimization, which essentially means going from what you use and paying for that versus paying for what you need. In fact, I would even make a caveat here that it's essentially going from pay for what you provision versus paying for what you need. Because the fact of the matter is that you could be provisioning more than you're actually using, and that in effect might also be different than paying for what you need. So you have to be very careful about truly understanding the differences between provisioning, usage, and requirements. So where do you get started? Cost optimization really has a variety of different elements and components that are not always intuitive, and depending on your level of scale and familiarity, can be pretty different. So what we're going to talk about now is how do you get started? What are some of the main tenets and some of the main priorities that you need to think about? And what are some of the tools that help you really start developing a cost optimization practice within your organization that lets you take the best advantage of your investments using AWS? The first thing we're going to talk about in this section is identifying the 4 pillars of cost optimization. Traditionally, we define these 4 pillars in the following categories. First and foremost, we're going to talk about right sizing. And by right sizing, we typically mean identifying the right capabilities, features, and functionality within a service that meet your requirements at the lowest possible price. Second, we're going to be talking about reserved instances and the benefits of reserved capacity, as this is truly instrumental in letting you get real economic benefits when you adopt AWS. The third area we're going to cover is elasticity and how to best take advantage of your infrastructure by maximizing utilization, reducing redundancies, and taking advantage of some of the tools and capabilities that AWS and our ecosystem give you to be able to best track and manage your running infrastructure. And lastly, and perhaps the most understated component of this of these 4 pillars, is measuring, monitoring, and improving. As we'll discuss throughout the course of the presentation, one thing that we really want to stress is that cost optimization is an ongoing practice. It's not something that gets resolved in one single instance or in one single attempt. It's something that requires fine-tuning and requires a certain level of development internally that allows you to create your own best practices and your own procedures that eventually get you to the point of comfort where these things work the best for your organization. So let's focus a little bit on right sizing. The first area that we talked about in the context of right sizing is how can you select the cheapest instance available while meeting the performance requirements that you need? So one thing that we always want to stress is that there should never be a compromise in capabilities at the expense of price. You always need to be able to run your workload using the capabilities and the features that are necessary based on your technical requirements, first and foremost. Otherwise, this is a little bit of an exercise in futility. However, there are multiple ways in which you can really get some great economic benefits by choosing the best combinations of CPU, RAM, storage, and network utilization that can allow you to downsize and reach some real financial improvements. And we're going to cover some of this in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. Thirdly, we're also going to be talking about how can you leverage solutions and services like Amazon CloudWatch that allow you to set alarms and metrics and logs that fundamentally enable you to keep track of how you're using these instances and when you have an opportunity to improve or change the instance family or the instance type that you're taking advantage of and improve that performance and reduce the cost. Now, one thing that we always talk about when we talk about right sizing is that when you're thinking about cost optimization, the rule of thumb is to always right size and then reserve. However, if you don't have the ability to really get that level of technical thoroughness where you're going to be able to determine the individual characteristics of the instances that you're needing to run, reserve first, because the savings from reserved instances are truly very significant. And there's a variety of ways in which you can actually work within those reserved instances. So having that reserved capacity is really, really important. Which takes us to the second set of points, which is reservation. So reserved instances or reserved capacity, I'm sure many of you are familiar, but for those of you that are not, is a purchasing model that AWS enables that allows you to get reserved capacity on either 1 year or 3 year basis and having the option to pay either nothing up front, a partial payment up front, or paying all up front. These three different levels of reserved instance allow you to also gain different levels of discounting. Clearly, the more you pay, the greater your level of discount. So when you have the opportunity and you have workloads that are relatively predictable, as we'll talk about in a minute, having reserved capacity can really help you get up to 75% in savings. Another really critical element around reserved instances is that they're not exclusive to EC2 and compute. They're available for any instance-based service, including our database services like RDS, our NoSQL services like DynamoDB, our data warehousing solution like Redshift and Elasticache. So effectively, what you're going to have is the option to reserve a variety of different services, and you can do it in a combination of different ways that best suit your budget, your requirements, and your preferences. It is important to outline, and it's a caveat that a lot of different services have slightly different prices depending on the size and region. So it's critical that as you start to do your capacity planning, you do a real analysis and careful planning on where you're going to reserve your instances and for how long, because there might be subtle price differences across the board. So we've talked for a minute about right sizing and reserved instances, and let's move into the next category in reserved instances, which basically is how do we think about coverage and how do we think about utilization? So reserved instances are very helpful from just a purely financial perspective where you can get the savings from upfront reserve capacity. However, they are optimized for certain types of workloads or certain types of use cases because that gives you the ability to think about where can I best place my resources. So RI coverage is ideal for resources that are always on. So if you have a workload that is going to be running consistently and where you have at a minimum a certain level of capacity that is either unchanged or with minimal variation, These are ideal scenarios for reservation. The second is utilization. If you do have changes in utilization, you can flexibly move and change RIs and merge and split agreements as you need, so you can actually take advantage of the best possible instances that you might have under reserve capacity. So RIs are not a monolith that once you have them, you're stuck with them and you can't really do much with them. There are multiple ways in which you can actually merge RI families and change the way in which you're going to use them to really meet your utilization requirements. So when you think about reserved instances and reservation in general, the rule of thumb is to target anywhere between 70 to 80% for your always-on coverage. So if you have a workload that has a certain percentage of instances that are always on or that are consistently operating, having at a minimum 70 to 80% will get you real significant economies of scale, and you're going to get some really good savings. And we also recommend that you reserve when you're thinking about having at a minimum 95% RI utilization rate. If your utilization rate for RIs is low, you're really not getting the benefits of the reserve capacity and parking your capital up front. So it's important to both look at the amount of coverage that you need and also how frequently you're actually taking advantage of the reserve capacity that you've already paid for. The third area, or the third tenet around cost optimization, is elasticity. And when we think about how to increase elasticity, there are really two main components here. The first is to turn everything off that is not in production. One of the great benefits of AWS is that anything that is not turned on, you're not paying for. So if you have non-production instances, and that could, a very good example could be dev test or workloads that maybe run only overnight or only during the day, when they're idle and you turn them off, you're already saving a significant amount of money because those resources are not, on the clock, for lack of a better term, when they're not being used. So thinking about how to manage your non-production instances is really, really critical in terms of how do you actually maximize your utilization and how can you scale up and down depending on peak capacity. The second element around elasticity is how to take advantage of auto-scaling. And by using auto-scaling during production, you can really get into a significant level of detail around scaling up and down based on on-demand usage. So auto-scaling allows you effectively to have logs and alarms that give you the option to track how your resources are being used, whether it's for peak capacity or whether you're at a lower level of utilization, and have visibility into what you can effectively turn off. As we always do, we also give you a rule of thumb, which basically is that for elasticity concerns and for elasticity planning, you should shoot for about 20 to 30%, as obviously commensurate to what we talked about in reserved instances, of EC2 instances that run on demand to handle elastic needs. And we know this is really critical and particularly important for organizations that have seasonality. That might even be during the day or during a particular workload period over the course of the calendar year. There are multiple different organizations and workloads that have very spiky requirements, and in this case, having everything reserved is just not going to meet the needs. So having on-demand options truly helps drive those requirements on demand and only for the period that you need them. So let's talk for a second about how right-sizing and elasticity can help you lower cost. So one thing that we've started to think about and explore in a little bit more detail is how can more small instances compare against larger, fewer instances. So we looked at an example of a customer that is using instances in the US East region at about 720 hours per month, so pretty much full capacity. And what we're finding is that if that organization uses 29 M4 large instances at about 12 cents per hour, their monthly cost comes down to about $2,500. So 29 general purpose instances, 12 cents an hour, pretty decent, pricing there. You're spending about $2,500. But if you compare that same level of capability using a smaller T2 medium instance, but instead of 29, you use 59 at about half the price, your bill is already $300 lower. So if you think about how you can compare the same capability using two types of instances, you might already be in a position to save a significant amount of money by just reducing the size of the instance to something that is a little bit less expensive. So the critical thing here is when you're looking at all these different activities, you're going to right size, you're going to do reserve capacity, you're going to try to get much more elastic and predictable in terms of your forecasting and measurement capability. One of the things that you have to always think about is this is not going to happen without a series of metrics and targets that you need to hit. All of these activities are really not going to happen unless you have a pretty well-defined dashboard or set of metrics that are going to be the governors of how you actually look at your cost savings. So some of the key metrics that you need to look into, and we don't recommend that you take 500 metrics because it's going to be very, very difficult to track. Nobody's going to do it, and if there's delegation, the quality of the data will probably be degraded. But if you think about choosing the 4 key metrics of governance for cost optimization, you're in pretty good shape to really start developing a cost optimization practice. So first and foremost, think about how many instances are going to be turned off daily. If you have a pretty solid target around your percentage of underutilized or non-utilized instances, you can already start doing some really good forecasting in terms of how much money you're going to save by having idle resources or by not paying for idle resources. Second, think about what percentage of instances can be right-sized. So where are you over-provisioning? And this is a very common thing we see when an organization is doing planning. Historically, based on a lot of legacy behavior, over-provisioning is a very, very common practice. I wouldn't even call it a mistake. It's simply the nature of doing business. When you don't have the elastic capabilities that you have with the cloud, it's always natural to gravitate a little bit to overbuying and getting something more, even if your utilization might be lower, because then you're always ready for those spikes or peak capacity. Thirdly, think about the percentage of resources that are always on and how many of those could be covered through reserve capacity, and what is the best reserve capacity mix for you and your organization. And again, think about reserve capacity not only in the terms of getting the instances that you need, but also what does your budget cycle look like? What does your cash flow look like if you're a smaller company? What's your preference in procurement? Is it a yearly thing? Is it a 3-yearly thing? So think about the portfolio in its entirety. And lastly, look at percentage of RI utilization. Are you really using those RIs? If your RIs are not being used consistently, you're probably leaving money on the table as well. So setting up these metrics and these targets is going to help you develop the practices and the best governance for your cost optimization approach. So how do we put this all together? We've talked to a certain degree in a little bit of an academic sense how you can start approaching and tackling some of the most frequent issues that cost optimization will challenge you with. So let's take a little bit of a side step for a second and talk about a really important concept when we think about cost optimization, and that is the elastic compute unit. The elastic compute unit, in the very simplest term, is a normalized unit that we've developed to let you compare the amount of processing power that is consistently being used across any number of instances. So it's instance agnostic. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to get a sense of what you're using today versus what you might be using in the future in a single unit type that can then be translated into multiple instance families or multiple instance types that can help you either reach the capabilities that you need or reach the capabilities that you need and reduce costs at the same time. So ECU is an important metric and an important unit to remember, because that's how we will benchmark the performance that you're achieving today versus the performance that you might be needing in the future, and how can we reach those same goals at the lowest possible cost. So looking at an example, we have a company that is growing at 2 times their year-over-year compute growth. So if you remember from that ECU description, this organization was going from 584 ECU units in August of 2014 to 1,192 ECU units in August of 2015. So that is essentially double the number of ECU units, but however, they were able to decrease their monthly costs by 33%, which is counterintuitive, because if you think about how am I actually reducing my estimated costs if I'm actually doubling my capabilities and my requirements, well, it all goes back to how are you actually doing and achieving your goals technically, while at the same time looking at the components on how to reduce the pricing. So to solve the growth challenge, the first thing we have to do is look at what is our ECU per hour cost today and how can we actually bring it down. So if you look at the metrics in this chart, we started off with an ECU per hour of 7 cents per hour, and we were able to reduce it to as low as 1 cent per hour and essentially plateaued at about 2 cents per hour. So that's a very, very significant savings. When you multiply this by multiple ECUs over a really, really long time, these savings are not immaterial. They really, really start to add up, and that's where you start to see the big savings. So the first step to get to that level was to think about, well, what is our ECU use daily? And how much of it is consistent versus how much is it spiky? So the first thing that we were able to do was to see that the customer was spending a lot of money because they were using a relatively old instance. Well, actually a really old instance. They were using M1s on demand. So their ECU per hour was pretty high. When they moved to a compute optimized C4 on demand, they were able to reduce those costs to 2 cents and essentially get the same capabilities, and sometimes they're even improved, because as the instance families mature and as we innovate, our pricing has consistently been not commensurate to our level of innovation. It doesn't go up with innovation, quite the contrary. It has historically gone down. So what you see is that there's a really good level of savings on a much newer and a much more modern instance. So what was the impact of right sizing? So as we mentioned earlier, we were capable of reducing those costs from 7 cents per hour to 2 cents per hour, reducing the costs by about 70% simply by moving to the most modern instance. And you can probably do that today across many of your workloads. If you're running M3s, you can probably move to M4s. If you have compute-specific requirements or memory-specific requirements, think about what's the right level of instance and how are you getting your best performance. But also keep in mind that this should never be at the expense of your workload always running in optimal capacity. The second step was reservation. So one of the things that we were also able to do was to identify that there were a number of instances that were always on. If you look at this chart, there's a very significant number of instances that are very consistently running. They're not very spiky. So by creating some reservation and by buying some reserved instances, this organization was able to solve another portion of their savings by reducing unit costs by up to 30%, simply because they knew that there was some capacity that was going to be operating 100% of the time, and because they knew that they could target those targets with our eyes, get the best possible savings, and get the discounting that is available from reservation. So when you start to add up the savings from right sizing and from reserved instances, it really, really starts to get very significant and really material. So when you start to think about these two things together, as we were talking about a minute ago, and you go from 7 cents an hour to, at a point, 1 cent an hour, and even if you plateau at 2, you have a net 85% reduction in unit cost. So if you're using hundreds of thousands of ECUs per month, and you have workloads that are both predictable, even if to a certain degree, and that have the capabilities to be reconfigured using the right instance sizes, you could be saving 85 cents on the dollar. And just think about the scenario of coming back to your finance leads, to your CFO, to your COO, and telling them, there is a way in which I can reduce the cost of my operation by 85%. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of very happy people when you have that conversation. So it sounds pretty easy, right? I mean, we've basically said some things that are probably very intuitive for many of you, maybe newer for some of you, and that's right sizing, reserved instances, elasticity, auto scaling. Sounds Easy, right? Well, the reality is it's actually quite complex, because to do this and to do this correctly, you need to implement a series of both behavioral, procedural, and best practices management that are not always available in every organization, or might have just not been thought about to the level of detail where they can really become part of the run rate business. So the first thing is, what's your scale? A lot of the things we talked about today are very manageable if you are running a small set of instances, or if this is all very centralized. But if you work in a large multinational organization and you have 30 development centers and people all over the world, and everybody's spinning up their own instances, that can be pretty complex. So tracking and managing all those instances is really not simple. Second, there's a behavioral change component that is really important, and it's very understated. When you have an organization where people are not incented or trained, or there's no procedures for them to do the right level of tracking, measurement, and management of these instances, it's very likely that it won't happen. I know we all try to do the best for organizations, but sometimes work gets in the way. There's a lot of different things that need to happen, and some of these administrative tasks, if not articulated correctly, can have some challenges. So doing them in a consistent way takes training, it takes some processes, and it takes some documentation that might not always be available. Thirdly, and as a result of both scale and behavioral changes, visibility. Tracking and monitoring instance utilization, reserved instances, auto-scaling logs is complex. And I would venture to say that most organizations today do not have a best practice where there's a dashboard or a reporting engine that gives you all these tools so you can actually run a report and see what's going on. So if you're lucky, you might have already built it, you might be under development, or you might be running a lot of these things with manual logs or even Excel files. But to do this at scale, you probably want to get a little bit more sophisticated. And lastly, this is an area that requires ownership. If this is delegated at the business unit level or at the individual level, the risk of failure is pretty high, because it's not easy, and it's difficult to do. And like I said before, it requires some level of control that might not be there. So getting all these points together is critical to make it successful. So cost optimization governance, that's why we left it towards the end, really takes cost optimization to a completely different level of practice, where it transcends technology and it becomes both change management, resource planning, behavior training, documentation, etc. So how do you uncover the cost optimization opportunities is one thing that we have to explore in a minute. The first thing that we can talk about is, how do you tag resources? So tagging instances is really one of the simplest and most beneficial tools that we have, because it allows you to identify an instance used, by who it was used. You can reallocate it to a cost center, and it gives you very clear visibility and tracking of how that resource is being used, and how frequently. And there's really just a lot of benefit of understanding what you have out there. This in turn allows you to identify what is always on, or what could be idle, and how you can actually work within those parameters. It allows you to identify instances that could be downsized and potentially replaced for a more economical, lower sized or lower capability instance. It can give you the option to identify instance types that could be transitioned into reserved capacity and get savings from there. And it gives you really two critical things that are not technology necessarily, but they're important for your own ability to manage your costs, which is to get a dashboard of the status. So have clear visibility across the board of all your instances and how they're being used, and how to report on savings, because now you can clearly identify, filter, and trace resources that are being used or not used accordingly to your plans and to your budget. So to do some of this, AWS provides some really, really valuable tools. So the first is AWS Trusted Advisor, which is part of our support portfolio, of our larger support portfolio. And with AWS Trusted Advisor, you have the option to not only run a bunch of analytics and tools that give you the option to drive cost optimization, track performance, ensure you have secure resources, determine fault tolerance in your applications. And it's really something really remarkable that helps you to get a much clearer view of your entire portfolio and how it's working. Secondarily, we also have Cost Explorer. Cost Explorer is a little bit of a different tool, but what this allows you to do is it gives you the option to manage and track your expenses based on past behavior and have the option to forecast and do planning based on how you've historically used AWS resources. So with Cost Explorer, you have the option to look at how you've used different instance types in the past, your historical level of spend, if you have peaks and valleys, seasonality, where you've been able to get savings. And with these two tools in tandem, now you have really a pretty powerful way to look at your existing working portfolio, look at what you've done and how you've spent in the past, and be able to match so you can get the best analysis and pro forma view of how you can actually get some savings. In addition to the tools that AWS provides, we have a really healthy and strong ecosystem of partners that gives you a lot of these same tools and benefits and more. We have great partners like Cloudability, Cloud Health, and Cloudimize that not only give you the ability to track and monitor instances, but they give you the ability to kill them, to repurpose them, to reassign them, to do chargebacks. There's really a very healthy portfolio of tools and solutions that we have here. And for all of you that have attended any of our summits, we're doing some really good work and partnering with them to show how this can enhance your cost optimization strategies and portfolio. So moving forward, one of the points we were talking about a couple of minutes ago was all of this is great, but now you have to be able to see it so it can be shared and analyzed at any one particular point in time historically, and to do pro forma analysis and be able to think about how this is going to work in the future. So having a good dashboard and having a good set of analytics tools is literally as important as everything you've done with all your capacity planning and your right sizing and your RI performance and purchases, because you now need to have the option to look at this information, reconcile it against whether it's meeting your demands, whether it's commensurate to your budgets, and getting a sense of trends and particularly areas of opportunity. So if you look at this very simple dashboard, it gives you a really clear view of how you can get some additional savings by moving from on-demand to reservation. That's really, really straightforward. Secondarily, you have the option to determine, what you have on Elasticity, how you're dealing with RI coverage, how is your RI coverage utilization working out, and how are your existing RIs being taken advantage of. So this type of dashboarding is important to get you the analysis tools and the visibility that you can share and circulate within your organization. Now, building tools like this sometimes does require a little bit of effort, and this is where, again, internal resources and partners can do a great job together, because there are certainly some best practices that can be shared around. Moving on into the whole concept of change management and addressing how an organization can best work with cost optimization. One thing that has to be stated is this creation of a culture of transparency. Cost optimization is only as valuable and only as useful as an organization's ability to really, have clear visibility into their resources, into their usage patterns, into how resources are being allocated, managing accounts, managing, chargebacks, and allocating costs to specific business units. So it's not just about setting the metrics and targets. That is a fundamental step. But the second thing that we always recommend for organizations looking into cost optimization is to develop a cloud competency center. This is something that has been very successful in some of our customers that have been working on cost optimization for a while, because it creates this element of governance and rolling out best practices, rolling training, creating a framework that is consistently applicable across the organization, being able to identify, the areas that need improvement. And a lot of this stuff cannot be done on, a part-time basis or, at 7 o'clock at night after all of you have been doing your jobs, for the last 12 hours. This is something that really needs some dedicated attention and requires, a pretty crystal clear level of detail. So having a group that creates this culture of change and transparency is really fundamental. And one thing that we also want to emphasize when we talk about the Cloud Competency Center is we need to create a lean culture. Organizations that perform the best in terms of cost optimization are those that are really interested in taking advantage of how do you maximize your resource utilization and not have to over provision, overbuy, or follow kind of the old legacy trajectory of playing it safe. It really is an exercise in trying to understand how can you be lean, transparent, and measured, but at the same time keeping the performance of all my applications and keeping all my stakeholders operating and with the best possible performance. The last element we always recommend to create a cost of transparency is to work with enterprise support. AWS has a variety of support options, including our enterprise and business support. But enterprise support in particular gives you the ability to work with technical account management, with the trusted advisor, and a variety of different tools and resources that can really get you to the point where cost optimization becomes a part of your business. It's not just something that you do once and that once you get it rolling, it kind of like lives on its own. AWS support can help you work within the parameters of what you need to do to keep this program up and running. Because one point that we've also not covered today, just because of the level of complexity that it would require and the number of services that we can discuss, is cost optimization doesn't end with compute. Cost optimization can also be translated into storage. We have a vast storage portfolio that has a number of different features and capabilities that allow you to reduce costs if you can compromise on retrieval performance, if you need archiving versus hot storage. There's a number of ways in which you can do that as well, not to mention the level of savings that you can do if you're bringing databases and you want to use our managed services like RDS. So cost optimization, we've used compute as the example simply because it's perhaps the most mature, but also because it's the best understood. But cost optimization doesn't really end there. So working with our support organization is really important. So with that, I think we have an extra slide here. I am going to close the presentation and leave it up for Q&A.